Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this meeting of the Public-Petitions-Committee meeting. We have apologies today from David Stewart and Adam Ingram, and Maureen Watt is attending in place of Adam. I spoke to Adam on Saturday night, and he's now well on the way to recovery. Can I remind everyone that they switch off their mobile phones? Is there anything else that might make a noise in the committee? And can I ask the committee if we may take item 4 in private? Thank you. Can I welcome the Minister for Children and Young People, Aileen Campbell, Mr Rains, Ms Britton and Ms Happa. Today we're going to take evidence in advance of our inquiry into child sexual exploitation. On that basis, I wonder if I could invite the Minister to make a short opening statement and then invite Annette Britton to make also a short opening statement, and then we will proceed to questions. Minister.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to provide an update on the 3 areas of work that were identified by Barnardo's and how we've been taking those forward with Barnardo's and our other stakeholders. As the committee is aware, we commissioned the University of Bedfordshire to research the scale and nature of child sexual exploitation in Scotland. Findings from the research were published in October 2012, setting out that whilst there's a lack of research on child sexual exploitation in Scotland, what is known in Scotland is consistent with what is known to be taking part in other places across the UK. We are now considering next steps to explore the prevalence and improve local data collection in Scotland around child sexual exploitation, and have recently commissioned the University of Bedfordshire to continue their work in this area by piloting a data monitoring tool and a self-evaluation tool with a local authority in Scotland. And providing that pilot is successful as anticipated, the tool will be rolled out across Scotland to support practitioners in tackling this issue effectively. This research and the further work to be carried out by the University of Bedfordshire, together with a number of other streams of work which I'll outline shortly, collectively supersede the actions identified in the 2003 Vulnerable Children and Young People Sexual Exploitation Through Prostitution guidance, which were made by the previous administration. Last year, we launched Scotland's first national website in conjunction with Scotland, Scotland's hub of child protection expertise based at Stirling University, and the Scottish Child Protection Committee's Chairs Forum. The website includes clear, accessible information on what the public should do if they're concerned for a child's welfare and information on wider child protection matters. We've also recently carried out a mapping exercise to identify any local areas with gaps in the provision of their services for a number of areas, including child sexual exploitation, child trafficking and children missing from care. And that information is currently being reviewed and will then be developing a common code of protocol setting out how services should work together locally on different aspects of child protection. Barnardo's also called for dedicated child sexual exploitation guidance, and we've since had the opportunity to discuss this further with Martin Crew, the Director of Barnardo's in Scotland, and Mark Ballard, Head of Policy. And we've agreed that supplementary guidance on this issue is not required. However, changes to the National Guidance for Child Protection in Scotland 2010 will need to be made. Our consultation on the refresh of this guidance closed on the 31st of March, and we're working closely with Barnardo's to consider their proposed text to be included. All consultation responses will be reviewed in the coming months, and proposed changes will be explored by the Refresh Working Group. In addition to our work to address the issues raised by Barnardo's, I'm pleased to advise the committee that Scotland's first National Working Group on Child Sexual Exploitation convened for the first time on the 25th of April this year. Over the course of the year, the group will consider the issues of how well young people are supported and the difficulties services have in identifying and supporting them, review the actions being taken forward in other parts of the UK, such as the action plans set out by the UK Government and the Association of Chief Police Officers, and highlight areas where further national work should be progressed. The group will report back to me at the end of the year. The National Risk Assessment Toolkit for Child Protection, which was discussed with members in February last year, was rolled out last November. And this tool aims to lead to a more consistent and effective approach to picking up the indicators of child sexual abuse or other kinds of abuse, and follow-up practitioner workshops are currently being held across Scotland. The revised version of the guidance on child protection for health professionals, which is often known as the Pink Book, and the National Framework for Child Protection Learning and Development in Scotland were both published in December last year, and both will strengthen the ability of practitioners to identify and to respond to sexual abuse and other child protection issues. We're also working with the new single police force, Police Scotland, to develop new ways of capturing information on crimes involving child sexual exploitation. Our Getting Our Priorities Right guidance was published last week and will help practitioners working with children affected by parental drug and alcohol misuse. The committee will likely be aware that we intend to introduce the Children and Young People Bill into Parliament shortly, which will enshrine the Getting It Right for Every Child approach. And through the bill, every child and young person will have access to a named person, someone charged with keeping their well-being at the forefront of the services that support them, and making sure that services are joined up in how they provide that support. A new approach to inspecting children's services has been developed, and that's currently being piloted. And that approach builds on the powerful existing model for child protection inspection, and will examine how well services support all vulnerable children and young people. And I know that Annette and Helen will probably tell you more about that shortly. Now, I know that both Bernardo's and the committee have concerns also about social media. For many children, the internet is not simply a device or a form of technology or a tool, it is an integral part of their lives. And we believe that parents should be supported and empowered to protect their children online, and that it's not simply a matter of filters and hardware, but rather understanding and awareness amongst parents, children and young people about the risks of the internet. And we're working with many stakeholders in Scotland to improve that level of understanding, particularly through schools. And members may recall that the Scottish Government supports the UK Safer Internet Centre's Connect with Respect 2013 Safer Internet Day theme, and launched an Internet Safety Awareness competition for all Scottish schools, which coincided with Safer Internet Day on the 5th of February. And responses to the competition were excellent, with Kilmont Primary School in East Dunbartonshire winning the top prize. And of course, we're doing a number of other things to do with e-safety. Our work is ongoing. I'd like to reassure the committee that we're working with stakeholders to ensure a coordinated multi-agency approach. With the recent child sexual abuse revelations in the media, it's important that we continue to strive to put children at the centre of all that we do. So thank you, Convener, for the opportunity to make an opening statement to outline some of the progress made so far since I last appeared in front of this committee, and happy to take questions from the committee members when we open to a question session. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for that presentation. Before I move to Annette Bruton, I should have welcomed Dr. Sarah Nelson, who's advisor to the committee as well, and can remind members that as we have many questions to ask, that we can try and keep them as brief as possible, and if we can have the same with the witnesses, then we can get through a fair amount of work today. Ms. Bruton.
Thanks very much, Convener. The Care Inspectorate welcomes the opportunity to be here to discuss this matter with the committee. I'll set a short context for the committee as my opening statement, Convener, if I can. Our interest in this is the duties that are placed on us to inspect and regulate care services across Scotland, and that includes care services for children and young people. Key in amongst these are the strategic inspections that the Minister referred to of the inspection of services for children, which within that focuses not only on the broad spectrum of needs of children, but on very vulnerable children, and follows on from 2 rounds of child protection inspection that have been in place since 2005. The Care Inspectorate has taken that work on from HMIE, and a new report on the findings of the second round of those child protection inspections will issue quite soon. We should be able, in answer to the questions of the committee today, give you data from that report, however, if you need that information. Our new inspections of services for children are multi-agency in nature. We look at the work of the Social Work Department of a council, the Education Department of a council, the police, health and any third sector partners they're working with as part of our seeking to provide public assurance to identify best practice and to identify whether there are significant weaknesses that need addressed in areas of child protection and services to care for children. In addition to that, the Care Inspector also has a duty to carry out regulatory inspections, and for the interest of this committee, some of the inspections that we carry out in a regulatory function include, for example, the secure accommodation and care homes of children and young people. And given the link between the potential sexual exploitation of children and runaways, that's an area that allows us to focus on first-hand the experiences of children living in care facilities. So between those two areas of inspection, both at a strategic level where we're looking at what strategic partners are doing to improve the quality of care for children, and at the level at which children are actually receiving that care, the Care Inspectorate has a locus in both of those. The Care Inspectorate is an independent organisation, and we seek to support government and the policies of government, and at the same time provide to government our independent view of both the assurance we can give on children's care issues and also to support improvement in the field.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Again, I just reiterate, let's ensure we optimise the session that we have this morning with the Minister and ladies and gentlemen. So again, I appeal for brevity in both questioning and answers. May I kick off the ball in terms of asking primarily the Care Inspectorate and indeed the Minister. The Care Inspectorate commissioned a 3-month research project into CSE issues for looked after children, a contract that was won by the Centre for Excellence for Looked After Children in Scotland. That seems a very short period of time for a very significant piece of work. And I would ask Mr. Rains if in fact you were aware of this and what your input to that particular project was. At the Child Protection CSE conference on the 30th of January this year, Minister, you announced the establishment of Scotland's first national working group on child sexual exploitation, an independent group drawing on expertise from across the public and the third sector. I wonder if you can explain how you see these initiatives that are coming from government and their findings liaising with each other, and indeed with this inquiry, which was set up before the initiatives were announced. And can you tell us how long you think these are going to last and when we can actually see some production from them?
I'll start. I'll leave Annette to talk about the work that she's commissioned from Celsus. But from our point of view, of course, we're very pleased that the committee here is looking into this very, very important issue. And any work that we do has to be complementary and not to duplicate in the work that you're doing and raising awareness of this issue. So the working group that I announced at the end of January was very much designed to be complementary, to look at areas and issues that weren't necessarily things that you were looking at within the committee itself.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you give an area where you think there is complementarity and there's no overlap?
Yeah. We want to make sure that that the research on child sexual exploitation is fully looked at and investigated. We want the working group to look into that. That's maybe not an area that the committee was as geared up to do, that we can use our opportunity to make sure that we liaise with other parts of the UK about best practice in other areas like that. So the working group met for the first time last week, and certainly there is an offer there if you want to engage with the clerks, with the working group, to make sure that the work going forward is truly complementary and doesn't duplicate any of the findings. But I think, you know, when we look at it in the whole, that it's good that there are different groups, two different groups, a committee within the Parliament, our working group, which is looking specifically at areas that we've set out in the terms of reference for the working group, to make sure that this issue is properly looked at and that we can move forward with clear identified areas of best practice, good work to make sure that we can help children who may be experience childhood sexual exploitation.
Could I then ask Ms Bruton, in terms of the research project, and also Mr Rains, if regarding your input to it. You know, I asked the question about a 3-month research project into a very, very major issue. It seems a very short time to come to any sort of, if not conclusion, recommendations.
Indeed, Convener. The research project had a very specific purpose, and that was to inform our thinking about our future inspection methodology. The purpose was not to produce a report that would be the definitive final research on the sexual exploitation of children. We were particularly wanting to focus on what was known about the sexual exploitation of children at this point in time who are in care or who are very vulnerable. And the reason for us commissioning that short piece of work is that in the period of 2013 to 2015, the Care Inspectorate has in its work plan a project, a thematic study into the very area that the committee are looking at. And as part of that thematic study, we will, through a number of different methodologies and indeed through commissioning further research, look into this area and be able to produce an independent report for the public on this matter. The purpose of the research was to inform our thinking about what needed to be in that further study that we would carry out both at our own hand as independent regulators and in terms of understanding the literature review that was around in the environment at that point in time. So the 3-month study was never intended to be a 3-month study that would inform the public about where we are in terms of the sexual exploitation of children, but rather an internal study for the Care Inspectorate to inform our thinking about a methodology for future work that we will do as part of our inspection regime.
But forgive me, on the basis that this committee had started the inquiry, do you think there might have been some more or better communication as to how that, you know, what contribution that internal inquiry could make to this committee's inquiry?
It was certainly never our intention to keep information from the committee, but we did it as independent regulators who need to establish how they will carry out the methodology and act independently to inform the public and Parliament about the work that we see as first-hand regulators.
Okay. Mr. Rains, any?
I would only add to specific answering your question. Yes, my team was aware of the research that had been commissioned. We liaised quite closely with the Care Inspectorate, not least in the development of the whole inspection cycle. And it seems to us entirely appropriate that the Care Inspectorate would be commissioning whatever work was felt to be necessary to inform that inspection, which members of the committee will be aware has already kicked off. So there is, I guess, an element of urgency in needing to carry forward with whatever work is necessary to inform that.
Okay, thank you. Minister, you said in your conference speech that we had no reason to assume the risks so visible in England are not also present here in Scotland. The National Action Plan in England has highlighted a number of examples of good practice. Does the Scottish Government have plans to use or pilot any of these in Scotland? If so, which ones?
Well, that's one of the areas that the working group will be looking at, is looking at the recommendations from the work that's ongoing elsewhere in the UK, and to test and to look and check the applicability for a Scottish context. So certainly that's one of the rules that the working group will be looking at. But, you know, for instance, toolkits, other things that might be ongoing could be some of the recommendations that come from the working group. And they will be reporting to me at the end of the year, and we'll be working through the course of the year to make sure that they can look at everything that's may be applicable to tackle the issue here in Scotland.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if I may now open up this to the rest of my colleagues. Angus MacDonald.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Good morning, panel. Further to comments regarding the Child Protection and Child Sexual Exploitation Conference in January. I believe you also indicated in that speech, Minister, that the Children and Young People Scotland Bill, which was introduced a couple of weeks ago in Parliament, will enshrine the GIRFIC approach. Now, you touched on this in your introductory remarks, but how specifically will it address child sexual exploitation issues, in your view?
The Children and Young People Bill will be putting, like you correctly say, the key elements of GIRFIC on statute, getting it right for every child, and that's about placing the child at the centre of the way services are designed and delivered around them. So it also will be ensuring that their well-being is paramount. So very much part of that will be ensuring that they're not affected by sexual exploitation. So we do believe that this will also enable services to work much more collaboratively around the child and make sure that there is much more coherence around the way services are delivered for that child. But also beyond GIRFEC, there is a number of elements that we want to place on statute around looked after children as well. So for instance, the definition of corporate parenting to be enabling much more of the wider public sector to have a role in corporate parenting, make sure that they are alert to the responsibilities they have for looking out for that looked after child, that will enable much more coherence in services to enable to mitigate against child sexual exploitation. And of course, we're extending the age by which looked after children can expect to be helped by local authorities or the public sector up to the age of 25. So there are a number of areas, while maybe not specifically related to child sexual exploitation, but certainly do enable us to make sure that the well-being of that child, every individual child across Scotland, is maintained and looked after, and that looked after children will have much more attention within services that are delivered to them, that will help all children and young people, but specifically as well, though, this group of children that we're looking at today who have exhibit a particular vulnerability.
Okay, thank you. Certainly when I was a councillor, it was drummed into us by officials that, or officers, that we were all corporate parents. Yeah. And it certainly applies to elected members at all levels, whether it's council or within the Parliament. So I'm pleased to hear that. And also the joint working, in my view, is always a plus. So thank you.
It should be. We fund and support Who Cares Scotland to ensure that message that everyone has a responsibility as a corporate parent. When Who Cares delivers much of that training, that includes that training being delivered by young looked after care leavers themselves. So I'm very much an important part of our work.
Thank you. Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. We're concentrating on why this happens and making sure that children are protected and from childhood exploitation. But we need to also concentrate on who is perpetrating this. And so could you maybe give me some idea of, from your perspective, how you're working with the police so that we can break these chains and have some successful prosecutions of child exploitation?
Convener, if we could perhaps address that. In terms of the inspection of services to protect children, we do that through a joint inspection methodology that includes police officers. So I'll ask Helen Harper to come in a moment and give the panel a very brief detail about how we do that. But essentially what we're looking at when we're inspecting how effectively services are actually delivering on that matter of prevention, as well as dealing with the aftermath of sexual exploitation. We would be looking to see what data local authorities, the police and health hold, how they're using that data and how they are using that as a preventive strategy. And if you'll permit us just one more minute on that, Convener, Ms Harper would say a little bit more about our new methodology and how we address that.
I think it's very important when we're thinking about the police's involvement in the whole issue of child sexual exploitation, that we think about the police information that they may hold at a much earlier stage before we're getting to prosecution, when we're talking about sharing information about children that may be vulnerable. And one of the things that we have found through the 6 years of child protection inspections, taking a multi-agency approach, is that the role of the police in that early information sharing, the intelligence gathering, the picking up information and sharing that with other partners to make sure that decisions about any concerns about children are fully explored at an early stage is really, really important. And we have seen that improving over the course of the last few years. Child sexual exploitation is something that is a very secret activity. It's very hidden. It's rare that that's overt, and so it's very important that at that early stage that all the information is shared. And that's really, really critical to beginning to unpick concerns about a child and what may be happening. So in terms of that early intervention, the police have a really critical role to play. When we are undertaking our inspections of children's services, that's a strategic inspection, we have all partners around the table. So we're looking at holding all of those partners accountable for the work that they are doing to make sure that children are safe and are kept safe.
So does data protect, just before you come in, Minister, does data protection not allow the police, for example, to inform care homes to be wary of certain individuals approaching the establishment or children in the establishment? Or
Through you, Convener, it's a good question, and there should be no impediment to data sharing. So the child protection issues always trump any other data sharing considerations, and so our expectation would be that data should not be held back for reasons of data protection when actually a child's safety, and that should pertain to teachers, to social workers, and to the police and to health. So that's something that we've seen improving, as Ms Harper says, over the last 6 to 7 years, but actually there's still some way to go in that, and a common understanding of practitioners about the urgency of sharing that data is an area that we work on both in policy terms and indeed in inspection terms.
Sorry. Do you want to, on that point?
On that point, yeah. It was just a point, pardon me, a point on, 2 brief points. A point on data. The committee might wish to know about the Information Commissioner recently issued a statement about the sharing of data where the well-being of a child was at risk, which makes absolutely clear that the Data Protection Act should not be a barrier to sharing concerns or anything that might be putting at risk the well-being. We can certainly make a copy of that statement available, and that might help in that question. The other point to mention is clearly we operate a very different environment now after the 1st of April. We have a single police force, and that means 2 things. There's certainly a huge appetite on this new single police force to think about ways in which the integration of its previous functions might best come together to address this particular issue. And we have Malcolm Graham, who's in charge of this agenda, the Assistant Chief Constable, as part of the working group, and he's certainly very keen to ensure that they make full use of the opportunities that integration will provide.
I was going to just alert the committee to the letter that was issued and how that has been also kind of helped by the GIRFEC programme board, which maybe goes back to Angus MacDonald's question about the ways in which the legislation, the Children and Young People Bill, will help us look at this issue as well, because the GIRFEC programme board is very much gearing up for GIRFEC becoming part of the legislation, and the work of the programme board about has been part of the work that's led to the letter being issued by the Information Commissioner as well. And I don't know, did you say that Malcolm was on the working group that we established as well? So there's close working links, and the opportunities with Police Scotland are there for us to make sure that we can properly look at this issue and work collaboratively with the new police structures that are in place.
So, through you, Convener, Minister, are you working, for example, with the Minister for Community Safety in developing local protocols so that there can be multi-agency working groups in areas where this is a major problem, and to break the perpetrator networks?
Collaborative work is key to all of this, absolutely, and certainly across government there's no artificial silos about how to try and tackle some of these issues. So certainly government continues to work and engage with the police, local authorities, health colleagues about trying to make sure that we get that kind of data flagged up as early as we can, to make sure that there's a kind of preventative angle as well to this, and make sure that people are alert to the signs and issues that may arise to let us tackle this much more effectively. But there's always work to be done on this in terms of how we get to the nitty-gritty of who's committing these atrocious crimes.
Okay.
Just a small point. Minister, you had mentioned earlier about applicable for the Scottish context, that it was a national plan in England. Is there anything from the national plan in England that may well tie into what my colleague Maureen Watt has just asked, is there any practice from there that you're hoping to adapt into the Scottish?
Well, the working group will be looking at the action plan to make sure if there are things that flag up best and good practice, that can be adapted for a Scottish context. But certainly I mentioned the tools there from the University of Bedfordshire, and we're piloting that out in some local authorities in Scotland. So that's an example of us taking something that's good and from the get-go getting that out there in a Scottish context to make sure that we can refine that and make sure that can then be rolled out appropriately across the country. Thank you.
I just want to run just a brief question. In terms of, I hear what you say in terms of data sharing, and it's good to hear about the information that will be shared across Police Scotland and also the multi-agency approach. But are we doing anything to think? Clearly, this committee is committed to shine a light into every dark corner, and that requires thinking outside the box. I mean, what are we doing? Are there any new initiatives? For example, are we tracking abusive people that might be hanging around children's homes, which is very visible? I mean, I know we've got to protect individuals and watch, how we do that. But what are we doing to think of doing things in a totally different way?
Sorry, Convener, if I could maybe start by giving some examples of the kind of practice we're picking up in our inspections. One of the things that we're looking for in our inspections is to see that national policy is being implemented, but the other thing we're looking at is to see where, at a local level, people are actually coming up with solutions that are actually helping to tackle this problem. So, for example, in Aberdeen City Council, which I know well because I worked there until last year, there's a daily meeting of the multi-agency group at a level which is close enough to know what's going on with individual children, but senior enough to make decisions. And every day, individual children are discussed. Children who are in care homes who've disappeared overnight, or two girls who might be in separate schools but who are engaged in the same behaviour. So that the multi-agency group actually thinks about what else might be going on here, and it always asks itself the question, what else might be going on here? That sounds a bit organised, that sounds like there's a pattern emerging here. So it allows the organisations who are involved in that, and that's health, the police, schools and social work, to actually look to see on an individual case-by-case basis for very vulnerable children where there's behaviour that might indicate that there's either coercion or sexual exploitation of that young person. So that's one example. Our inspections, our new services for children inspections, will actually be trying to surface those examples of good practice, which in the first instance might look like they're actually onerous or they couldn't actually be sustained, but actually places like Aberdeen have shown they can be sustained and have actually been able to interrupt some of the dangerous activities that young people have been drawn into, and in fact exploitation of some young people. So we've seen some examples. We'll be looking for more examples over the coming months and years in terms of our inspection methodology, and all of that we will be feeding into in the immediate term into the strategy, the National Strategy Group, but also not waiting 3 years to write a triennial review on that, but actually identifying the best practice and sharing that with practitioners across Scotland.
Okay, thank you.
Judge,
sorry.
Maybe just on that one
Serene.
point, the one thing we are doing, which isn't being done anywhere else in the country, is there in the Children and Young People Bill. By ensuring that every child and young person up to the age of 18 has a named person whose job it is to pick up on all the clues and signs that maybe different professionals are picking up, but have no way to put that together, that person will be in a position to pick up, over due course, on the signs of child sexual exploitation and be able to, hopefully be able to pull together the right support for it. We're ensuring that every vulnerable child and young person through the Children and Young People Bill has a child's plan, one document, one thing that brings together all the things that needed to support that child. That's not happening elsewhere in the UK.
Jackson, sorry. John Wilson?
Just for clarification, Convener, is Mr Rain saying that every child will have this document that will follow them, or is it only children who are deemed to be at risk? Because the difficulty is, what you've just put in the record there, as you've said, every child, just so we could be quite clear as a committee, is that every child or everyone that is identified as being at risk?
Every child and young person will have a named person, and every child who is required to have one, who is deemed necessary to have one will have a child's plan. So there's two separate things.
Right.
So all vulnerable children, young people will have a child's plan.
How will children be aware that they have a named person, and how will that named person be identified to that child?
That's part, I guess, of the territory of what the children and young people will be. But one of the provisions set out in the Children and Young People Bill is that it's the responsibility of health boards up to the age of 5 to provide the named person, and I think the presumption is that would be the health visitor. And from the age of 5 upward...
Who checks the named person?
Checks the named person.
In terms of how they're qualified and who nominates them?
Well, there'll be...
Part of universal services, the health, as Phil says, you know, the universal service is the health service when the child's in its earliest years, and that's why they've got the responsibility of being the named person in the most formative years of that child's life, and that carries on to the next universal services, which is the education, and thereafter there's a handover, but certainly there's lots of good practice. Again, you go back to the GIRFEC programme board, which I chair. There's lots of good practice at the moment, currently ongoing, regardless of where the bill is at the moment, which is putting a degree of consistency across the country about the way in which GIRFEC is implemented, but there's lots of good practice in the way in which the named person is carried out at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
No, Convener, sorry, I didn't get an answer to the question about how the child will be able to identify who the named person is, because I think in this situation where in the health board up to the age of 5, that's fine because we have health visitors and various others who will liaise quite closely with the family. But it's when we get to the situation where children are older, how does the named individual that's supposed to be ensuring the protection of that child and the opportunity for the child to report any issues that they may have, how do those individuals become identified? Is it through the Education Authority? Is it through social work? Is it through the health boards? How do we make sure that this named individual is actually identified to the young person? The young person has the confidence and the ability to actually directly speak to that named individual.
That will be part of the implementation of the bill, and it'll be the responsibility for those up to the age of 5 for the health board to ensure that children and families are aware of who their named person is. And then from the age of 5 upwards, it'll be the responsibility of the local authorities, principally, I think, through education services. And one of the things that will be accompanying the bill will be regulations and guidance that will set out very clearly what the expectations are on the relevant people for whom the duties are placed. So it's an important question, and it's important that when the bill is implemented, that these things are in place.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Is it possible for me to say that a core part of the methodology for our children's inspections going forward, our joint inspections of children's services, is to explore the territory around the named person, to make sure that named persons understand what their responsibilities are, and to make sure at a strategic level that services are preparing and equipping the named people within those services to understand their responsibilities and to make sure they have the tools to take those things forward. Of course, for children and young people, they will talk and confide in people they trust and know. It may be the named person, it may be other people. The named person is certainly, the system for named persons is certainly not trying to exclude and stop children and young people from building good relationships and talking to people that they know and trust. And that's a really core part of keeping children safe, is that we provide good listening, sound, trusting relationships for children.
Convener, I'm sorry to extend this. Ms Harper has just indicated that children, quite rightly, will go to someone they have confidence in, they will confide in an individual. How does that individual link to, or potentially link to, the named person? Because what I'm looking at is the joined up approach to protecting children, no matter what age. And the difficulty is if a child builds up confidence in an adult or another individual, and they confide in that individual, express what's happening or their fears and concerns and experiences, how would we ensure, and this maybe Mr Rains can elaborate on this as the bill goes through, how do we ensure that person they confide in is able to contact the named person or get in touch with the named person, because I do see some issues arising from this in terms of the future operation of this process.
Yeah. We have always had a situation in Scotland where children may speak to anybody about things that concern them. They may speak to parents, they may speak to friends, they may speak to professionals that they're in touch with, youth workers and so on. What we know is that in Scotland there is actually a high level of alertness around services about how to protect children, and that's got better, and we will be seeing that in our forthcoming publication. So we've always, this is not a new issue that children may speak to somebody in any service and they need to then take action to make sure that children get the help that they want. The named person is not designed to obfuscate that process or to cut across that at all. Part of what being a named person is that you understand that you have responsibilities to that child. You also have responsibilities to other children, and that means that if another child talks to you, that you use all the processes that you have already got in place to set in motion some chain of events that will help that concern be explored. The named person doesn't make that more complicated or more difficult. It's another level of support for a child and another level of gathering information. It doesn't cut across anything that's been in place before.
Thank you.
I'm conscious that we're somewhat constrained by time, but I think this is a particularly important aspect. Certainly new. I wonder, Anne McTaggart, just a brief question.
Thanks, Convener. It would be remiss of me to go on any further without asking this question. You had spoke earlier about the new working with the new bill coming in, the working up until 25. What part of what kind of funding is going to go with that, or what is going to be dropped off at the other end? Because obviously the funding would need to go with that, because that's not currently the way that it is.
Financial memorandum that will accompany the bill, which will alert you to the kind of financial implications for this proposal as well. So certainly that's all been looked at, and we had a lot of people responded to the consultation about this issue, about whether or not it needed to be strengthened, the commitment up to the age of 25 or not. So certainly there's more information on the consultation response that we published a few weeks or a couple of months ago, and certainly we've outlined the proposals when we published the bill a couple of weeks ago as well.
And it would be highly remiss of me not to mention that when you mention named persons, that every child, every young person would have a named person. Have you got quotas as to how many that named person will have? And my last job and within social work, you know, there was cases there up to 70, so that young person or that named person may well have up to 70 young people under their jurisdiction.
Yeah, and as Phil had said earlier, you know, there's a process of writing accompanying guidance and regulation that will go along with the bill as well. But certainly the idea, has been said as well, is about this named person. It's about trying to cut through a lot of the kind of bureaucracy to make sure the child truly is at the centre of the services that are getting delivered around them, making sure that someone has an oversight over a child who has a particular vulnerability as well, to make sure that there is someone looking out for them. So when the bill's presented to Parliament, it has been published, there will be also an opportunity to ensure that we get guidance and regulation absolutely right, to make sure that people can, it's not just a kind of tick box exercise, to make sure that it has a meaningful impact on that child's life.
I fully appreciate that, and I do look forward to seeing the financial memorandum that goes along with that, as to, because it is extremely important and it is all good and well, but in practice I'm not sure that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Let's move on. Jackson Carnell.
Well, having listened to all of this, Convener, I hope you'll allow me just to ask a question, because I've been quite taken in with this part. This is all, we've latched onto this with a certain degree of attention, but it's all struck me as being raising something of an expectation here suddenly, and I just want to be clear about it. Every child in Scotland is going to have a named person, and irrespective of any defined assessment of the risk contingent within the group of people that named person will have within their portfolio, I assume. And I'm just trying to understand, how many named persons do you anticipate there will be? What will the turnover be in named persons? And how, in practice, does that really establish a bond of confidence on which people feel they can rely? I mean, it's not the principle, it's just, it all seems to me to be a very huge enterprise.
Well, I guess it's important to recognise that although there will be a named person for every child, not every child will need interaction with that named person as well. But there has to be a way in which we can make sure that there's someone having an overview of what's happening to that child, to make sure that the early indicators of anything that would pose a threat or a risk to that child can be flagged up as soon as it can be. And that's why this named person will be, this particular part of GIRFIT will be put in statute. And it's already, you know, happening in areas as well. It's not a new thing. So, but certainly if the committee are interested in some of the more kind of specific elements of the bill, which will be looked at by the Education Committee, we're happy to ensure that clerks or yourself get an adequate briefing on some of that if you want, if that would be interesting. If that would maybe cut through some of the questions that the committee have.
In which case I'll ask my question now, which is really on missing people and children absconding from care. Because you wrote to the committee, I think just around a year ago, 19th of April last year, saying that you were looking with the Care Inspectorate throughout 2012, or had hoped to look with the Care Inspectorate throughout 2012, at ways to improve the collation of information regarding children going missing and absconding from care. And I wanted to start by asking, what were the deficiencies you had identified in the collation of care, collation of this information that you now wanted, or you were looking through 2012 to seek to address? So I wanted to understand what the baseline was before then maybe understanding what actions you feel followed from that.
There's been, I suppose, since we indicated that, there has been the trafficking summit as well, so a number of the commitments that came from that are about data collection, appropriate data collection as well, and certainly the Care Inspectorate will want to input into this question further. Phil, do you want to add anything on to the other points that Mr. Carlo's raising?
Yes, I mean, one thing to say is that much of that work has been folded into the work that was kicked off by the Cabinet Secretary for Justice on anti-trafficking, which is the wider, not just I think children absconding, but also human trafficking more generally, because children absconding is not the only part of it, but it's a big part of it, so it made sense to bring those two streams of work together. So we're taking forward the work, identifying that. There's maybe answering the two parts of what I see as your question. The first is we have, at the moment, no national number, no national way of counting absconding in terms of the kids who go missing from care. So in a sense, there is no proper baseline. There's no way at the moment that we collect that information. So the issue is, how can we collect the information? How can we improve it? And what we've identified, I guess, in terms of the steps going forward, is that when you think about kids missing from care, you need to think about different groups of kids. And for some of those groups of kids, the issue might be easier to address. Others, it might be more difficult. Where you talk about kids who go missing from residential schools, it's maybe more straightforward to put in place a way of identifying, counting the numbers, aggregating them, coming up with some way of reporting on it on a national basis and taking the right kind of action. When you think about kids who are in foster care, kids who are in kinship care, it's a bit more difficult to get your head around, to get those numbers. There's steps that could be taken, but it's a quite different problem or a quite different challenge than it is for residential care. So the work that's going forward through the Anti-Trafficking National Summit is to see if we can do something, I guess, more quickly about the residential care element of it, see what we can put in place for collecting data there, and then to start exploring how can we get better at collecting data about kids who go absconding for care more widely, the children who are missing. There is, of course, I guess, a bigger set of issues about children who go missing from services more generally, which is an issue that almost ultimately defies an absolute data collection system, and probably something that we've been thinking for a while is probably areas we'd want to move into, in the sense the kids who are invisible to services, not just the kids who disappear from services.
So the problem, as you defined it, really was different streams or sources that people can be missing or absconding from. And the deficiency was really it wasn't being collated, actually. Is that essentially?
Yeah, at that sort of level. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
We ask regulated care services, we require regulated care services to provide us with information about young people who are absconding from care establishments. And we don't have confidence that that is always being followed in the way that it should be. And that is one of the streams of information that we were wanting to look at as part of the work that Ms. Bruton was describing at the beginning. In relation to foster care services, as Mr. Rains has pointed out, it is far more difficult to be clear about young people that are going missing from foster care. Is that missing for a few hours, missing overnight, or so on? Particularly when young people have got quite complex contact arrangements with home and are travelling perhaps to home and back. It's quite hard sometimes to keep track of those. So that's another area that we were wanting to explore further. In relation to the strategic inspections of child protection services, we have been asking questions over the last 3 years of child protection committees about their handle on the children who are going missing, collating those figures, understanding what's going on in their local areas. And we have found that in terms of young people running away, that's really an underdeveloped area of practice. Services have not, in the main, been as good as they might have been at pulling together that information, about sharing information at an earlier stage about young people who are going missing, and particularly young people who are either going missing in groups maybe with a friend or with a group of young people, or going missing on a regular basis.
I wonder if you can help me on that. You say young people may go missing during the day and the evening. They could then be sexually exploited, but then return home in the evening. You're not capturing that information, are you?
Yeah, no. That's right.
Right, I'm conscious of the time, and I want to stop this session at 11 o'clock, if I may, and so I appeal for brevity. I think I've got Maureen, Anne McTaggart, then Maureen Watt and John Wilson to answer the question. Okay.
Thanks, Convener. It's a question about training of the professionals that are likely to come into contact with obviously vulnerable young people, such as teachers, police, health professionals, youth workers, social workers. Like currently, just now, includes spotting the signs of CSE, and how do you plan to move on to ensure that training of such professionals will include this in the future? Has it been upgraded any?
Last year we published the National Framework for Child Protection, Learning and Development, and we also developed National Risk Assessment Framework for Child Protection, along with the first comprehensive toolkit, both of which encompass child sexual exploitation. And in addition to that, the working group will be looking at areas of training that might be useful, engaging with education colleagues, such as, for example, for you, Ms McTaggart. So certainly there's a number of things that very recently have been completed, and also work ongoing with the working group. And I should also point out the pink book for health professionals was also refreshed as well.
Can I add to that?
I was just going to say, I think some of the training need is around improving our understanding of how children may be groomed and manipulated. That's a really important issue.
I think the greatest part of the training need is the resourcing and of the time for people to spot and work with these vulnerable young people. They could be trained all the time in the world and have all the knowledge in the world, but if you've got 70 underneath you, and realistically, that's just not feasible. What kind of signs are you spotting there?
I mean, those things that I mentioned were done with extensive consultation as well with workforce as well. So I mean, they've been published reflecting the things that professionals and people who are on the ground who feel
and
they
they're
need.
Great.
So
they're absolutely great.
Mm-hmm. And again, the working group is also looking at that as well.
But on the ground, it's not happening.
Let's move on.
I think it is happening.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, you said in your speech at the conference that teenagers don't feature in child protection nearly as much as younger children. How do you think we can improve, following on Jackson's point, how do you think we can improve child protection for these older children who are the group, we hear recently of child sexual abuses getting it younger and younger, but it's mainly that kind of older group. How do we focus more on protecting them?
And that was, why in the speech that I gave at the end of January, we flagged up this kind of anomaly between some of the figures and certainly indicated that we wanted to make sure that we had a better handle on that, ask some of these questions, get even, the committee work that you've been doing will probably highlight some issues as well that we can explore. But certainly from my point of view, being Minister for Children and Young People as well, that we can't just always concentrate on the very earliest years. We need to make sure that the whole life course of a child and any vulnerabilities or risk that it might be prevalent for that young person is properly dealt with. So that's why we want to use the working group as a mechanism to look into this issue a wee bit further for us, to make sure that we can get things right for children in their adolescence and make sure that the proper protections and alertness of individuals and professionals is there, and that we can capture some of that information in a much more comprehensive way, because we do understand that there's a real need to get underneath what's going on for those teenagers.
Convener, I wonder if I could just very briefly say that we've talked a lot about professionals and professional responsibility today. We believe that there's some room yet to speak more directly to young people, because young people of that age, as Ms Watt has pointed out, is a group that we know less about, and they are more likely to go to their peers for support. And so therefore talking directly to young people, giving young people advice, and young people use each other as support in all sorts of circumstances in their lives, and actually being really open about this and actually having this as an open conversation with young people will be a way in which we can support them in helping each other to keep safe. And I think there's room for more work on that.
And finally, I'm going to ask John Wilson to end the questioning.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, officially. The issue, clearly, Minister, is that we're getting almost on a daily basis more and more evidence coming from the rest of the UK and other parts of the world in terms of how child sexual exploitation is taking place. The Minister, you indicated that you were going to produce a national child protection guidance and review that guidance. You will be aware that in terms of the Welsh Assembly has produced supplementary guidance in relation to the sexual exploitation risk assessment framework. Do you intend to adapt or introduce similar guidance for practitioners in Scotland ahead of to the end of this year? Because I'm conscious that as these individual cases arise and we get more and more of them, that clearly there is a need to update as quickly as possible the guidance that takes account of some of the issues that we can identify from other parts of the UK or other parts of the world.
Well, I said in my opening remarks there, and you correctly identified that there's a refresh of the National Guidance on Child Protection, and certainly there's been some very positive discussions that government's had with Barnardo's, for instance, about how do we make sure that that reflects properly issues surrounding child sexual exploitation. So that guidance and those discussions will reflect the issues around child sexual exploitation, and that will be ongoing work, and I think that's a positive way to take it forward as well, and not least as well the other things that I mentioned in answer to Anne McTaggart around the frameworks and the toolkits. Those are things that are there now, have been published, the Pink Book is published. All these things reflect child sexual exploitation to alert practitioners and professionals in their daily life about what are the things to look out for. So there are frameworks and toolkits and advice there at the moment. The refreshed guidance on child protection will reflect child sexual exploitation, and the working group is also has a keen eye on this as well, and will be given any recommendations to us around best practice that's happening across the rest of the UK, and make sure that we can replicate that, roll it out in a Scottish specific way, and make sure that we do get the systems right.
Thank the Minister for that response, and due to time, I'll just be brief, Convener. The committee is also interested in terms of the operation of the Sexual Offences Scotland Act 2009 in relation to child sexual exploitation. Do you, Minister, have any information on how the Act is being used and the level of convictions or pending convictions that there may be at the present time or up to the present time in relation to the Act? And depending on your response, do you see any possibility of actually strengthening the Act or reviewing the Act at some stage to make sure that we are not missing something in terms of the arsenal of material that's available to the Scottish Government and others to try and tackle seriously the issue of child sexual exploitation in Scotland?
I have figures for 2009, but we can get back to you on that specific if that's okay with you, Convener. And certainly our conviction statistics have recorded 24 persons convicted of an exploitation offence under the Protection of Children and Prevention of Sexual Offences Act since that Act came into force. But I don't think that's the whole story, and there may be other convictions that are have been made for other reasons. But underneath that, there are areas which would relate to child sex or exploitation. So certainly happy to get back to you on the 2009 figures. Work ongoing to make sure that we get things right in terms of the legislation that's there to enforce some of the work that's ongoing, the opportunities with the new single police force, and the fact that we've got police representation on the working group as well shows that we have close links to make sure that things are as strong as they can be.
Minister, I accept your point about the offences or that have been taken to court under the Sexual Offences Scotland Act 2009. I'd be interested in, when you're gathering this information, Minister, if you could actually pull together some other offences that have been committed to children that have not been covered under this Act, and particularly look at why the Act has not been used where there may be sexual offences against young people that have went through the court system.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you very much for Minister, Ms Bruton and Ms Harper and Mr Rains for your evidence today. I suspect that we will probably want to revisit some of the issues that were raised today. I apologise that we've gone somewhat over the time that I'd planned, but I think, as I say, some of the new information that was brought forth necessitated further questioning. So may I thank you very much for attending, and we'll allow a few minutes to allow the Minister and the witnesses to leave, and then we'll reconvene at 11:05. Convene, and may I welcome Gil Patterson, MSP, to the committee meeting, and with his particular interest in petition 1105. What I'd like to do is go through these as quickly, but yet as meaningfully as we can, and decide which petitions we keep open, those which we feel might be closed. So can we start with petition 1098 and 1223 regarding school bus safety. Have members any comments to make on the issue, or indeed on the notes provided by the clerk, and also a letter from the Minister? I have one comment, if I may, and that's the length of time this appears to have taken. When being first submitted in 2007, and we're talking about a solution, potential solution to this by 2018, it seems an inordinate period of time. I don't know who's writing the book, but it's certainly quite an experience. Members, any comments at all? Angus MacDonald.
Convener, I think given the timescale for publishing the report on the costs of fitting the seatbelts isn't due until the 30th of June, I don't see any merit in inviting the Minister for Transport to the committee meeting at the moment. But it's clearly an option that we can retain if, you know, once we have had sight of the report when it's issued on the 30th of June, and perhaps invite him to a future committee meeting after the recess.
Do you agree? No. Sorry, John Wilson.
I accept the Minister's letter, but in the Minister's response, he indicated he expected the report by April 2013. We now see in the letter that he's now talking about 30th of June 2013 for the report being made available. Could I suggest we write to the Minister and seek further clarification as to the reasons for the time delay? I know they put in the reason, part of the reason was the awarding of the contract in December 2012. But it does seem strange that if you set a timetable for the end of April and then you then come back and say it's going to be 3 months later than what you actually anticipated. Now, my understanding is the Scottish Government does have a lot of information. We have been considering, as you quite rightly identified, Convener, this petition for almost 6 years. Mm-hmm. The committee has written to local authorities. We have sought assurances from COSLA. So there should be at least enough information within the Scottish Government confines to actually allow them to make some assessments of what's happening out there. And I would suggest that if we write back to the Scottish Government asking for further clarification. But I agree with Angus MacDonald that given that the final report won't be due until the end of June, then there's no point in this committee considering this petition until after the summer recess, at which point I would expect the Minister to come along to an early meeting of this committee to explain the findings of the report and what actions the Minister intends to take to resolve some of the issues raised in the petitions.
Jackson Carlo.
I'm happy with that, but I would personally, and I didn't expect to have to ask because I thought these issues would be resolved, like to understand what it is that since the 8th of March 2011 has been the obstacle to the offer of the UK Government to devolve these matters to the Scottish Government, such offer being accepted by the Scottish Government. And, you know, I don't wish to be unhelpful to colleagues, but my goodness, if we can't manage to devolve the powers for seat belts to the Scottish Parliament in over 2 years, it does start to make me wonder how we're going to, in certain circumstances, which I don't foresee arising, of course, devolve much wider powers to the Scottish Parliament as well. But I would actually now quite like to know what is the obstacle, because it's loosely defined as legal complications, but I've never really been able to understand what it absolutely is that is preventing this taking place.
Any other comment? I did write down that it would appear to be, I haven't phrased it as finally as Jackson Carlo, but it appears to be bureaucratic bunkum. I can't believe that this has gone on so long. And whatever the league, I don't accept that there's been a couple of weeks slippage in appointing the contractor, or that initial work not being unable to be undertaken prior to the 2012 Christmas holiday break. So I do think that we follow the suggestion from John that we write to the government and Angus MacDonald with a view to having this resolved as soon as possible after the recess. But hopefully the message will go out from this committee that everybody associated with the government should be operating as effectively as they can, and I don't consider 11 years effective. We will now move on to petition 1105, which refers to the previous submission, the petition we had submitted by St Margaret Scotland Hospice with a view to the cost allocation. So are there any comments to be made from committee members? Jackson.
Yes, with respect to Gil Patterson, who's joined us, I note that the Cabinet Secretary is awaiting an updated response, and I would like to see what that is. But I would also just like to note in the Cabinet Secretary's letter to this committee an implicit acceptance of a point which his predecessor was reluctant, I think, to commit to, and that is that if this is now not forthcoming, he would be willing to appoint an independent arbitrator who would be required to facilitate a resolution. And I know that's something I personally, I should say, had called for. I know other people felt that it would ultimately be of advantage. So I would like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for his very direct, proactive involvement in trying to take this forward. Those two things alone suggest to me that something might ultimately happen out of all of this. And I've always been of the opinion that as long as it is, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, as far as I'm concerned, have been as slippery as a bar of soap in a bath over this issue. And until, in fact, it is resolved, I'm reluctant for this committee to allow it to be distanced from its BDI.
Would you like to make a comment?
I'd be very grateful. Could I just inform the committee that, to my knowledge, on every single occasion, and it's many, that this committee has heard this petition, there has been someone in the gallery from the hospice, and today we have someone in the gallery again to hear the deliberations of this committee. And from the last visit here, I know that the people that were there and the hospice itself were very, very grateful for the comments made by the committee, to which they thank you very much. I know that papers have been received by the hospice itself, and contained in these papers are issues, matters that the hospice, its board, will need to consider. Unfortunately, or fortunately for one individual, the chairman had an extended visit to Australia and New Zealand, and has just returned. So the papers, as far as I'm aware, haven't been discussed. I happened to be at a function on Friday, along with a very staunch supporter of the hospice. That's Dennis Agnew, the former provost of Western Bartonshire. And at that function, the chairman was there with a lovely tan. We only spoke about 30 seconds. We didn't talk about business. So my presumption is that the matters contained in that letter, that correspondence from the Health Board, will be discussed imminently. And I know I'm a bit like a drug addict or an alcoholic, and just give me some more. But that's not the case. I'm not. It's not my purpose. The work that this committee has done, and the mere fact that the petition has been available to this committee, I think has helped enormously. I'm going to be probably into trouble, but I think both parties, both the Health Board and the hospice, benefits from this petition being open. And I would graciously ask, in light particularly what Jackson Carlow has just said, that the petition, I'd be grateful if this petition would remain open at the present time.
Any other views? Can I ask, that perhaps explains the comment you made about the Chairman, that the letter from the Cabinet Secretary indicated that an offer was made to St Margaret's on the 22nd of March, yet we received a letter on the 4th of April, again from the petitioner, so I'm not sure whether that's the problem. But I think we indeed should, while we keep it open, again, I have to remind the committee, this has been on the books for 8 years. You know, clearly a message has to be given that these things have to be addressed as quickly and as effectively as we can. So can we leave it leave it open until St Margaret's has had the chance to go through the paper and respond to the Health Board? Is that okay? Are we agreed?
The length of time is nothing to the distress and concern of people in the Greater Glasgow area who are served by the St Margaret of Scotland Hospice. And I hear what you say, but I mean, literally lives are at stake in relation to the outcome of this petition. And this committee has been the one constant focus in relation to keeping an eye and a light on it in this Parliament. And I'd be reluctant to see that go until we finally get the resolution that I think is achievable, but has been elusive.
Well, I think my point wasn't directed at the hospice. So we agreed we'll leave it open until we see a resolution of until after summer recess. Okay?
And many, many thanks to the committee. Thank you very much.
Right, agenda item, petition 1367 by Andrew Deans, member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, on behalf of that Parliament, on the banning of mosquito devices. Again, I open it for comment. Angus MacDonald.
As we know from the special session that we had with the Scottish Youth Parliament, they've been taking this very seriously, and we did ask them to go away and get some more evidence from other parts of Europe, for example, to see how they had dealt with it there. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a lot of information coming back following their attempts to find evidence of how it's been dealt with in Europe, although there have been examples from Belgium and France. I believe one of the options we have is to bring the evidence gathered by the petitioner to the attention of the Minister for Community Safety and Legal Affairs and ask what further action the Scottish Government would be prepared to take. However, the Minister did attend this committee and was fairly forceful in her view that it wasn't planned to take any further action. So I'm not sure where we're going with this petition now, given that the evidence that we had sought really isn't there. So I'm in two minds, convener, on this one now, whether to close it or whether to seek further information from the Minister. I would much as...
I'm interested in the approach that Angus MacDonald's brought to the consideration of this. I'm slightly disappointed. I mean, Mr. Dean's certainly articulate and was with us in the committee. However, this is a very extended additional submission, which I feel is more anecdotal than properly evidence-based. At one point, we get confirmation that 100 devices have been sold, and then that 100 devices are still operational. And I just, I'm sorry, I don't find that credible or constituting evidence. It also seems to me that individuals have volunteered that they think these devices are in use because somebody has had a conversation with them as to what it might be like, and they've realised that that might have been what they heard. I mean, I think my own view is that we should close the petition, but I'm happy in so doing, as a final, with a final flourish, to nonetheless draw to the Minister's attention the fact that we have closed the petition, but that to forward to her the submission that we've received from Andrew Deans in response to the open session we had with the Scottish Youth Parliament for her information, to see whether in her own mind there's anything further that she feels is necessary from that, but without really any obligation being placed upon her by this committee so to do, because I would be slightly embarrassed to suggest that what we are presenting to her is evidence on which I think she should feel compelled to actually act.
Maureen?
Thank you, Convener. As somebody new to this committee, I mean, I think these devices are insidious, but has there been any conversation with local authorities as to where these devices are being used, or the police, in fact? Because if people are feeling that they have to use these devices, surely it's a police matter in terms of dispersing people who, you know, are listening to this device. So I just wondered if you'd already considered that, since I've just joined the committee.
Sure, I'm advised that in fact that did happen some time ago.
Because I feel it's more, rather than banning something we don't really know enough about and its use, it's more a matter for local police and councils.
I agree, and I think I always hesitate to use this, the question now of where is the clinical evidence, but it says unclear whether it must. I mean, if I look at this, you know, it says it lists a whole series of places in which the town or local authority has been involved, but it says it's unclear whether or not these are being used, and I just don't know where we would take this, other than continue to operate as a mailbox. So we agreed that we close the petition, but do as Jackson suggests, which is send the information on to the relevant minister and allow her to, if she wishes to pursue it further, to do so. Is that agreed? Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Good. Petition 1400, which on behalf by Libby Anderson, on behalf of One Kind, on banning the use of wild animals in circus. Can I ask the committee for any comment?
Convener, could I suggest we write to the relevant Scottish Minister to seek clarification on whether or not he's prepared to take up the offer extended from the UK government to allow the bill currently going through Westminster to be extended to Scotland. I do know, and the petitioner's letter has highlighted some of the issues that have been raised in Westminster that currently don't apply to Scotland. We've got the Welfare of Wild Animals and Travelling Circuses England Regulations 2012, which came into force in January this year. And we have, as I mentioned, the Animal Health and Welfare, the bill going through Westminster that could potentially be extended to cover Scotland. I think the fear that's been raised by the petitioner is that if the Westminster government decide to regulate and introduce legislation for England, that we may have some of the travelling circuses moving to Scotland, to locate in Scotland, purely because they're trying to avoid the implementation of the Act down south. So it would be useful if we could write to the Minister to seek clarification as to whether or not what action the Scottish Government intend to take in light of the developments down south, but also whether or not it would consider extending the scope of the bill in Westminster to Scotland.
Do you agree? We'll do that. Thank you, John, for that. Petition 1426 on a national donor milk bank service. I draw to your attention the paper that we received lately from this morning regarding that, from the letter from the petitioner in response to the NHS GGC, Glasgow Clyde Health Board. I'm minded to suggest that we close this.
Agreed.
I mean, I think on the basis of closing it is contained, enshrined in the fact that the action has now been taken by the government. I mean, I know that. Oh, yes. Okay.
Although, Convener, there has been a late submission from the petitioner highlighting that there is an issue with Forth Valley Health Board, so it's just to flag up, Convener, that I'll be, as a local member, I'll be contacting Forth Valley Health Board for some clarification as to why they are not taking part, and I'll be happy to share that, any reply that I get from Forth Valley Health Board with the committee.
I think that would be appreciated, and forgive me, I overlooked that. If you could do that, that would be good. The decision is still that we're going to close it. We're going to close it. The decision is still that we're closing the petition. Petition 1439 regarding betting and loan shops in deprived communities. The petition called on the Scottish Parliament to urge the government to review the correlation between the prevalence of betting shops and cheque cashing penny loan type shops on our high streets and in our communities. Again, I open that for comment to the members of the committee.
Convener, while I'm reluctant to keep this petition open, I think the issue and the response from the Scottish Government clearly leads me to want to keep this petition open for one more bite at getting a response from the Scottish Government, because the Scottish Government says they will consider the issues of concern expressed in the petition when we review the town and country planning use classes Scotland Order 1997. At present, we do not have specific plans to review this legislation. We inform the committee when we will commence this work stream. Could I request that the committee write to the Scottish Government just to ask what the timetable is for any review that may be planned into the order, just so that we can actually then hopefully close the petition with the assurance that there is a review taking place, rather than this rather open-ended response that we've received from the Scottish Government at the present moment. It says that they may carry out a review, but they have no specific plans to do so.
I mean, I think on the basis, well, are there any other views on that? See, I feel that if the Scottish Government said they've got no plans for an urgent review, that simply to pat it back and say, well, when are you going to have one? And they come back and say, well, we're not going to have one. My view is that, again, we're not really exercising any decision-making or promoting any movement on behalf of the government. And I would suggest that we close this.
I'm minded. I mean, I understand the points that John Wilson's making, but I mean, I think the fact that the Scottish Government has no plans for an urgent review, that the areas are partly currently reserved for the UK Government, and the planning system is not normally used to address these matters. The fact that they've committed that the concerns will be incorporated into a review at a future point in time along with others, and I imagine what they need is a sufficient menu of matters to review. I mean, in some respects, I think that is a reasonable outcome at this stage, given the realities that confronting the committee and seeking to pursue the petition. In other words, the concern has been aired, the concern has been heard, the concern has been recognised. There is a commitment the concern will be addressed in the conduct of a subsequent review, and I'm not actually quite sure what more we can really do at this stage. And I'm sort of mindful, and I hear what John Wilson says, but I kind of rather feel, Convener, that what you've suggested will be the case, that we'll simply write and get another letter back that doesn't tell us anything terribly definite at this time. And I'm not actually sure that great purpose is served by that. So I'm minded to support your view that it should close.
I think that doesn't inhibit, at some stage, the petition coming back when more information might be made available. Shall we close the petition? Anne McTaggart?
Are we able to write then to the Minister just saying we're closing it, but to ask the question that we were going to ask, we were keeping it open anyway, to highlight the fact that the evidence that we've gathered and the information that we've gathered, and obviously the petitioner's concern.
I mean, I understand the motivation. By the way, I can understand the motivation behind the petition, and have some sympathy with it. But I just question what we're going to do by doing that. What will we achieve?
Convener, I'm the one that proposed we keep the petition open and write to the Scottish Government to seek clarification on the review timetable. It was mainly from the point of view of trying to understand the government's perspective in relation to the review. Now, we're talking about an order that was carried through in 1997. The standard excuse we get when it comes to planning decisions at local authorities is they cannot take a decision because it's out with their prerogative to actually make a decision relating to the location or the use of units, shop units within town centres and other areas. And it was really just that given that the number of payday loan companies and we've always had a large number of betting shops, but I think the prevalence that the petitioner has actually indicated of betting shops close proximity to payday loan companies is quite a worrying development within our town centres, which has really just escalated over the last 18 months to 2 years. And it's to give some comfort to many communities throughout Scotland that there is an opportunity, while not under the betting and gaming legislation, but under the planning regulations, to actually take some type of action, or local authorities are afforded the opportunity to take action against the increased use of shopping units by payday loan companies in close proximity to betting shops and other gaming institutions that seem to be cropping up in every town centre in Scotland.
Well, I mean, I think as one member feels quite strongly about it, Convener, I don't see any advantage in forcing a closure of the petition, and if what Mr Wilson is suggesting is that we seek to get some clarity on that timetable and that we allow the petition come back to us based on that letter, then I'm happy to go along with that rather than create a division over it.
Yes, Convener, I would agree. In hindsight, I'd be minded to accept John Wilson's argument, given that these vultures are appearing nearer to housing estates and within our town centres. I think it has to be brought to the attention of the Scottish Government once more.
The rationale behind my position was, is this the way of achieving, I mean, I should all abhor what's going on, but given the planning regulations and legislation, can we affect anything other than, as we say, write to the Scottish Government again? But if that's the view of the committee, then we agree that we should write to them and
Convener, anything that highlights the issue to the Scottish Government is good news in my book.
Okay, Anna Tye?
Yeah, just to agree with what Angus MacDonald just said. Really, I think, not that I'm a planning guru by no manner of means, but I think it will give them some comfort if we are seeking to write back to the Minister to see if there is anything that they can do with regards to planning legislation, and fully appreciate that the other decisions are made elsewhere. But it's a huge blight in our communities, every one of our communities, and yep. I think we need to keep it open and get back to the Minister.
Okay, we'll move on to petition 1444 from Florence Kennedy on the mutual repairs incentive scheme, which you will remember was raised by Ms Kennedy, asking the Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to provide incentives for mutual repairs on tenement properties, and in the course of that make representations to the UK Government regarding VAT in order. I think we've all received in our pack a letter from the Scottish Government explaining just exactly what is happening in terms of the pilot traditional building health check scheme is being developed, and the sustainable housing strategy will be published in the first half of 2013. And in the course of that, the Scottish Government will press for change in the VAT rate reduction for the home repairs. I just wonder if we wish to, well, I'll leave it open for comment.
Convener, in light of the response from the Scottish Government and the action that's been taken by the Scottish Government and the information released earlier this year, I think we can go ahead and close this petition. The Scottish Government have given a commitment as to the second part of the petition to continue to campaign to have VAT removed from improvement repairs that are carried out in tenements and other developments. So I think the petitioner has achieved what they set out to achieve, and the Scottish Government has responded accordingly. So I would propose we close this petition and advise the petitioner accordingly.
Agreed? Agreed. Petition 1452, received from Mr Vince Mills, calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Government to bring forward measures in all areas it has compensated to fulfil the aspirations of the People's Charter. I won't rehearse what was in the People's Charter. I ask members for their views. Can I make my my view is that we close this petition? As there is a government programme. I don't in any way demur from the view that it's well-meaning, and clearly there are some letters of support, but I think within the overall government programme, whether we agree with it or not, or agree with items of it or not, I don't see how we can take this petition any further forward.
I would support that position. You know, the Scottish Government set out its policies in relation to what is set by the People's Charter, and I'm not quite sure, given the sort of very broad-natured scope of it, that there's much that the committee itself could now seek to achieve by way of further action beyond that.
Any other comment? Do we agree? Close it now? Thank you. Close it. Yep. On the basis of the government programme, yes. Petition 1461 by Mr William Campbell on protection for third parties in the planning process. And members of the note by the clerk and the submissions, and I would invite members to contribute or make comment as appropriate.
I do have some sympathy with the petitioner, having served on a planning committee in the past. There have been issues that I've been aware of, which required police intervention. However, that is the way forward, in my view. The circumstances described in the petition are a matter for the police, and they should be considered in that context instead of part of the planning process. So, given that, I would suggest that we close the petition, convener. But saying that, I do have sympathy because there have been issues in the past, certainly within the local authority area that I represented. But as I say, it is an issue for the police, and we should leave it at that.
John?
In our meeting of the 19th of February, we agreed to write to the Association of Chief Police Officers in Scotland. Did we receive a response to that letter?
No.
Convener, given the issues raised in this petition, and Angus MacDonald's quite clearly indicated that some of the issues relate directly to policing issues around planning and harassment that may take place. Could I suggest we, and I'm sorry to have to do this, keep this petition open, but write to the Association of Chief Police Officers again?
Well, there is, I mean, just to interrupt, I don't think there is that association as such, given the new structure of Police Scotland.
Well, whoever would be the appropriate organisation to write to within the Police Scotland to get a response in this matter, because I think it's unfair, I think, to close the petition where there clearly are policing matters at issue here, without getting a response from the police and how this issue is dealt with at a local or national level.
I would support that suggestion, Convener. I mean, I do think it might be seen to be making a nonsense of our earlier decision to seek advice from ACPOS and simply to say that because it's no longer there that we're not going to bother waiting to see whether we can get the same advice from the successor organisation. So I think in principle, since we thought that advice should be sought, we should seek to get it from the successor organisation. What thereafter we're able to do, I don't know, but we took that view and I think we should fulfil it.
Well, I mean, I recognise the point that Angus MacDonald raised, but I agree actually with you and John Wilson that in view of the change in structure, at least it could be a warning shot or a highlighting shot, what have you, to the new organisation, with a view to us, once we get that response from Police Scotland, perhaps then closing it. Petition, penultimate one, 1465, by Tony Ivanov, calling on the Parliament to urge the Government to put legislation in place to enable local authorities to force owners of vacant plots of lands within towns, including former greenbelt land and previously developed areas, to maintain and keep these plots of land in a manner befitting the local community. Common good land. Angus.
Convener, I certainly note the comments from Falkirk Council's Head of Planning and Transportation, John Angel, who I know from my time at Falkirk Council to be an excellent officer. His comments on the use of Section 179 notices, in particular, in which he highlights the difficulty faced by councils when they cannot identify ownership of random areas of open space, even when carrying out land registry searches. Indeed, as a councillor, I came face to face with that problem on more than one occasion, and the petitioner's assertion that this is not the case in his reply are simply wrong. Mr. Angel also highlights that councils generally do not have budgets set aside for direct action, and if the likelihood of recouping that expenditure is low, then there's little incentive for the councils to go through the Section 179 notice route. The petitioner, Mr. Ivanov, makes a valid point regarding the lack of enforcement powers open to the council, as does Mr. Angel in his submission. And I was wondering if it would be within the committee's remit to write back to the Scottish Government asking it to consider introducing enforcement action in the future for Section 179 notices, given that if they don't have that power just now, there's not much incentive to serve the notices. So I wonder if the Public Petitions Committee could highlight that to the Government in the hope that they can take that point on board in the future.
Okay. Any other comment? Jackson.
I'm sorry, I thought we had also, I mean, I note the response we've received, but I thought we'd also sought to establish how many such notices had been issued, not just how many appeals had been made. I thought what we wanted to try and do was to quantify the extent to which the existing recourse was being exercised in relation to what we were being told was potentially a route forward without the need for anything new. So knowing how many, which is a trivial number in some respects, have been appealed, doesn't necessarily tell me how many there were to start with.
In fact, I believe we did write, and we did not receive a response from COSLA, so perhaps we'll write them again and remind them of the duty of this Parliament and respond. We don't send out letters just for the sake of sending out letters.
It may be that COSLA are experiencing a similar problem to us. If they didn't have that information at hand and they wrote out to all the local authorities, it may be that they haven't all replied to COSLA.
That would be helpful if they even wrote to us and told us that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think Mr. Angel's letter is probably one of the better letters that, more explanatory letters I've seen regarding this issue. And Angus MacDonald will remember, and John, the somersaults we went through on registration of land and who owns what and how we register it. But I do think that we should do as Angus suggested, write to the Government
Convener.
We'll keep the petition open right to the government, and we'll also chase up COSLA if you agree. Sorry, Maureen, what?
Yeah, Convener, I think I read somewhere in this paperwork that it was a relatively small number of pieces of land involved, but I can't think of an elected representative who hasn't come across this coming into their mailbox, and an issue which, you know, we would like to resolve but can't. So I think anything that can be done to keep this going and highlight what an issue it is in many communities, in my view, many communities,
Yep.
then I think the better. So I think if we can write to the various bodies, then...
So we'll write accordingly to the government and to COSLA. Latterly, the second one, to just try and discern the scope of the problem and highlight the section 179 issue with the government.
And the need for enforcement power.
And the need for enforcement. Okay, last petition 1466 by Mr. William Tate, urging the government to review the implementation and regulation of local authorities' charges for non-residential services. Do members wish to contribute or suggest the course of action they wish the committee to take? Jackson.
I suggest we refer the petition now to the Health and Sport Committee and invite them to follow the progress of the review that's being undertaken by COSLA in relation to the charging guidance for non-residential social care services on the light of the information that we've obtained at this point.
Okay, do you agree? Agreed. Thank you for that. We're now going into a private session for the last agenda item of today's meeting. So if the public gallery could be cleared, and it is now clear.